Shalom and welcome again to another edition of Speakers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. I'm your host, Rabbi Address, and thank you very, very much for joining us. These podcasts, as you may know, are designed to explore some of the issues that touch us and our families in light of the revolution and longevity that's reshaping our Jewish world and our Jewish community. We appreciate your support. You can follow us at Jewish Sacred Aging on the homepage of the website, jewishsacredaging.com. And we appreciate you liking us on the Facebook page, Jewish Sacred Aging on Facebook. And again, the website, jewishsacredaging.com. And it is with great pleasure that we welcome to the microphone the editor of a very, very unbelievably great book, recently published by the CCAR Press, Inscribed, Encounters with the Ten Commandments, edited by our colleague, Rabbi Oren Hayon, from beautiful Houston, Texas. And first of all, welcome, Oren, and I hope you're healthy, and I hope your family is well, given all the stuff that's going on this summer.
Thank you. Thanks for Yeah, we're all doing okay. We're trying to stay indoors and beat the heat and beat the pandemic at the same time.
Yeah, you've had a lot of heat. You've had a lot in the Southwest. And I guess it hasn't gone away, even with the heat. Wow, I guess so. This is an unbelievable book. And for our colleagues who may be listening to this this is a book review book, an adult education book, confirmation class text, etc., study guide for brotherhood or sisterhood. So it's all of these things. Encounters with the Ten Commandments. Oren, why now? Why this book now in the second decade of the 21st century?
That's a great question. And thanks for your kind words about the book. I feel really, really terrific about the finished product and really lucky to have had a chance to work on this and have it published through the CCAR Press. I think, ironically, this is probably the piece of biblical text that most Americans are the most familiar with. If you ask somebody what's in the Bible, they'll probably first tell you the Ten Commandments, and they're right, of course. And so we may have the impression, which I think is a mistaken impression, that because the Ten Commandments are familiar to so many of us in this country and around the world, that there is unanimity, agreement about what the commandments are and what they mean, when in fact the point of the book, I hope, was to demonstrate that there's real texture and some real interesting contrast in the way that different thinkers, different public figures, different experts in their fields understand the commandments and relate to them in their personal, professional, and spiritual lives. The part about books, its role in our culture and our society that I didn't anticipate when I began working on it a couple of years ago was really how fragmented and divided our culture would be today in 2020, how divisive our civic conversation seems to be, how divisive our even the most casual chat about politics or public life. And so one of the things that I've come to really appreciate about the book is that the book demonstrates that disagreement doesn't have to be destructive, and that different ideas can actually lead to constructive understandings about other people, rather than the thing that becomes a wedge to drive us farther apart from each other.
There's two things that leap out from just going through the book and just what you just said. Number one, the politicization of the Ten Commandments. How do you react to that? Because and to what, and first, we'll flip that second. What drew you, of all the things, Jewishly that you could edit a book about, what drew you personally to the Ten Commandments?
So I had been invited to contribute as an author to another volume which came out a few years ago, and that was a collection of essays about the 7 days of creation. Each of the contributing authors was invited to write an essay, a chapter about one of the days. And it's a lovely anthology. It's a really terrific work that that demonstrates different perspectives, different ideas about creation one day at a time. So I was really taken by the style and the format of the book, and wondered if there was another piece of text to which that approach can be applied. And of course, if you think about the sort of great epic biblical history of the Jewish people and Jewish life, there are a couple of these very significant inflection moments. The first one is the creation of the universe, and the next would be the redemption from slavery, and the third, and in my opinion, the most influential is the third, which happens at the top of Mount Sinai when Torah is revealed, and what was once a sort of loosely connected collection of individuals becomes a people unified by law and unified by our connection to text. So the Sinai moment has always really spoken to me personally as a Jew, as a learner, as a rabbi, and I knew that I wanted to spend some time focusing on that. And so by kind of cribbing the style of that previous book, where each author contributes a different piece, I think we've come out with a really exciting finished product. And so,
no, go ahead, finish. Yeah.
I was going to say, to your second question about the politicization of the commandments, it's always been kind of I don't know, somewhere between funny and and painful to me to see the way that the Ten Commandments have sort of made their way into, in certain places across our country, you may be likely to see the Ten Commandments painted on the wall of a courtroom. You may see a large sculpture or statue of them in front of City Hall or in front of a court building. And what is like to me about the way that text has come to function in those civic settings is that a text which is really meant to be elastic and fluid and open to centuries of different perspectives and interpretations has become quite literally written in stone in a lot of our cities. And the understanding that the subtext of that architectural overture being, of course, that the Ten Commandments are one thing that are universal, eternal, unchanging, and that have unanimous agreement about what they mean and how they should guide our behavior. When in fact, we've seen just in recent days, the Fifth Commandment, the prohibition on murder, for example, is being used in editorials, in protests, in television, cable news interviews, both to bolster the actions of protesters who are protesting police violence and those who are defending the police and their ability to yield deadly force when needed. So we can just see in the past month the way that one small piece of text, one verse of the Bible, is used so expansively to meet different rhetorical needs.
I don't know whether when you were editing this book and assigning the authors and the subjects within each commandment, how prescient you were, which is pretty good. I mean, you could take that to the Texas lottery, probably.
Yeah, I'd like to think I could take some credit for that, but
no, it's really so. And there's a whole, and I wanted to walk through some of these. For example, you just mentioned. So the Sixth Commandment essay, one of the essays talks specifically about, its title is Police Violence. And I mean, you pick up the book and say, well, here's the headline, and here's a colleague's essay, Rabbi Seeger, actually walking us through the Sixth Commandment and the difference between murder and killing. And by the way, it's a very even essay because in the middle of it, he says, there's stress and strain on police. You have to understand, like you were alluding, you have to step back and understand that you have to understand, I guess, both sides of so how did you choose this concept of police violence a couple of years ago when you were putting this together, or was this left up to the individual colleague?
One of the best parts about this process is that, that game sometimes you play where you ask somebody, if you could have if you could have a dinner party and invite anybody in the world to have dinner with you, who would you have there? So to me, this is the same kind of exercise. If you could study Torah with anybody in the world that's alive today, who would it be? So this is my chance to bring some of my favorite people, most entertaining guests, and most thoughtful colleagues to the table to learn Torah with them. And John Seiger, Rabbi Seiger, is a friend, and I really respect the work that he does as a police chaplain and also as a rabbi. And I think he occupies a position that not many of us do, to be able to see the real lived experience of law enforcement, and also to see the impact of an increasingly violent society on folks that are marginalized. He is there literally on the front lines to watch the impacts of this violence, both on civilians and on the police. And it was, I remember talking to him when he was composing the essay, and he felt a great sense of responsibility, because there is at the same time, an obligation to report accurately and fairly what he sees when he's responding to a call with his badge on, and also to represent fairly and compassionately the moral tradition of Judaism, which abhors obviously the loss of any innocent life. And I think the finished product is, again, as I said, I wish I could take credit for having foreseen the world we'd be living in today in the spring and summer of 2020. But in any case, the essay has become, I think, a really helpful artifact for us to turn back to when we try to make sense of, what does murder really mean? What does it mean for us to entrust the power to exact deadly force on another person? What are all the kind of moral calculations happening behind the screen, behind the curtain, when we as a society decide to arrogate that right to somebody in our city?
Just to pick up on this, because it is out of the headlines, and you live in a major metropolitan area that has seen its share of stuff. How have you begun to navigate the Black Lives Matter Jewish community responses this summer within your congregation? I know a lot of colleagues are being pulled in a variety of different ways, and if you don't mind just riffing on that for a little bit, because it does come right out of the tip.
Yeah, I've been, I feel really lucky to be part of the city and the community and the congregation that I am a part of, that I'm privileged to lead. We've been sharing conversations about race and racial justice for a couple of years now, which has made it a little bit easier for us to continue the conversation after the killing of George Floyd and the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement and the demonstrations that all of us have seen in our cities. I think it would be very difficult to be starting the conversation now for the first time. And so we have been striving to do our best to listen to the voices of Jews of color in our congregation and beyond it. Generally, I'm happy to say that the members of this community share the assumption that Jewish morality and Jewish ethics compel us to work for racial justice. Black Lives Matter as a motto, I think, lands on people differently than does Black Lives Matter as a movement at times. It seems that there is a little more suspicion of the latter than the former, maybe. But the Rabbinical Association and the heads of some of the large congregations here in Houston, along with the executive director of our federation, just actually pushed out a statement earlier this week in recognition of 30 days since George Floyd's death, a sort of perspective from Shloshim. What do we do 30 days after someone's death? Obviously recognizing that Jewish mourning rituals aren't necessarily used to remember Mr. Floyd, but instead to kind of think about, okay, just like we do when we're mourning somebody we love in Jewish life, the marker of a month past their death, affords the opportunity to pivot slightly, to open up a little bit more, and to start asking the bigger questions about what does this person's memory mean? What's the legacy they're leaving behind? How do we want to change our lives based on the messages and things and lessons that we've learned from their life? And so that letter that I've linked on my Facebook page, if anyone's interested, starts to ask those questions and starts to remind our community that showing up and waving a sign one day isn't the end of the conversation about racial justice in the Jewish community, but that we need to redouble our work toward making that a reality. And that doesn't just mean demonstrating against police violence. It means interrogating the ways that economic justice is connected to racial justice, to think about the ways that keeping our synagogues safe also has to be done morally with an eye towards preserving the rights and dignity of people of color who are coming to pray there, to think about who we hire to staff our organizations, what the racial makeup is of our boards and our religious school faculties, and all of those things that factor into what I hope is a holistic and wholehearted approach to racial justice and equity.
No, thank you. One of the other things, again, being very prescient when you put this together, leapt out at me when I was going through the book by our colleague Batya Ungar-Sargon, who writes an essay called Fake News and Its Challenge to Journalism. It's really an unbelievable prophetic essay. I mean, again, these essays could be, so many of them are right out of the headline, so a colleague can use these in a teaching thing. But there's a line in there, is what all these commandments insist upon is that we have to choose for ourselves the just path and not allow our personal histories, group pressures, or our own values to decide for us. Talk to me about how that plays out in her essay about fake news and the commandment of bearing false witness. Because we do live in a society, at the risk of being somewhat political, where we seem to be violating this commandment on a fairly regular basis.
Yeah, and I think that the essay and the principles in it come as a caution to folks both on the left and on the right, which is very important to me. We are now in this very strange world of fake news and accusations that are being leveled at whoever your ideological opponent of the day might be and their cable news outlet of choice. That essay and that cause and the principle behind it may be the one that causes me the most stress these days. I really worry about the kind of endangerment of truth as a commodity, and it is really hard, what she describes in the essay, to preserve a commitment to truth and accuracy and fairness when it is so easy and so familiar for us to engage in the practice of curating the social media bubble that we move around in, curating the social media feeds that we consume, the newspapers we read, the cable news channel that we watch. It's very, very compelling and almost seamless for us to just go through life only listening to things that we agree with, because it feels so comfortable and it feels so jarring to encounter stuff that we don't want to hear. And as she correctly points out, I think what makes it tough is that it comes down in the end to an individual commitment to truth and accuracy, and an individual commitment that sometimes has to fight upstream against very, very powerful social and commercial factors out in the world.
Yeah, that's why I was really struck by this essay. It was challenging to read. And as you say, because it touches so many things that are happening. And in all honesty, that's one of the nice things about the book, because so many of the essays touch on not in the luft, in the ether, but really what's happening today, and to do the linkage, which so many lay people don't understand. This real pragmatic, practical linkage between the sacred ancient text and the life that we're living now. I think that's the greatest, quote, selling point of this. Speaking of which, there's another unbelievably prescient. Seriously, if you can get the lottery numbers, you're in great shape. An essay around the fourth commandment. Tiffany Shane writes about technology and the phrase "thou shalt unplug," which I thought was really, really cool. I know a lot of us have tried. Right. talk to me a little bit about just the moral value of just saying enough, forget it. It's Shabbat, whatever it is, but I need to get off the grid for my own sanity.
Yeah. What I love about Tiffany's essay and about her as a contributor, it was really important to me to fill the pages of the book with words not just written by other rabbis. That feels like a bit of an echo chamber, and I really wanted to hear from some other people that work in different fields. Tiffany's not a Jewish educator. She happens to be Jewish, but she's a technologist. She works in media, and so she swims in this water every day of every week. And so I found it, first of all, really touching, and second of all, very effective for someone who makes their life in digital media to talk about what it feels like to, as you said, to just take a second and exhale. Maybe not all of us can make it happen for 24, 25 hours. Maybe some of us can just, start with a few hours at a time when we're taking a walk, we're listening to a piece of music, we're reading a book, we're checking out the magazine article we've saved all week. And we unplug, and it's especially hard, I think, during these days when we're all, work and school and relationships and family are all happening on a screen, just like this. We can't get away from the internet or our devices or our screens, and so I think you're right. It is unintentionally prescient to help provide some tools for people to build that muscle, to build that skill and the ability to disconnect for a few hours at a time, because it is, it's just not good for our brains. It's not good for our souls. It's not good for our relationships. And I know from personal experience, I share this with you because I'm terrible at it and I want to get better at it. But when I'm able to really give myself a digital Sabbath, as she describes, I come back replenished and hopeful in a way that I hadn't before. The pace of the world just seems to slow imperceptibly enough that I can feel its effect on the way that I breathe and the way that I talk to my kids, the way that I relate to the food that I eat. And it is sadly, it's a vanishing skill that I think all of us could stand to cultivate a little bit better.
Yeah, it's interesting, her insight, because as you said, she works in the field. But the beginning of one of her paragraphs is that she says, in a way, the Sabbath itself is technology, and as a revolutionary development within a society 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 years ago, in itself was a technology of its time. But it's a really great way to think about the Shabbat. As cool as the Heschel stuff is, but to a 16-year-old in confirmation class, to think that, Shabbat is equal to this, that it was this at that time. Again, the essays make this stuff extremely relatable and living, and a lot of it.
I love it. I love I love that passage you cited. I also I think as a teaching tool, the reminder that Shabbat is itself revolutionary and progressive, and not I don't know, not retrograde like we might think, that it's actually a way of moving forward into a kind of existence that's better for us and better for the planet. Could we work all day, every day? Pretty much, yeah. We've got great technology. We've got, chemicals that can keep us working later. We can get by with less sleep and less nutrition and don't have to move around. We can cram more productivity into a day than our parents and grandparents ever could have imagined. But at what cost? And we've had similar conversations when it comes to the food that we eat and the media that we consume and the you name it, the widgets that we produce. There is at some point the returns begin to diminish, and we'll start to see the consequences on our bodies and our relationships.
Reuben Firestone, who many of our colleagues know, and writes on the second commandment about idolatry. As these transgressions against what is proper in terms of human interpersonal relationships, which is a great definition of that. You toil with a congregation every day in your community. Congregational rabbinate is filled with all kinds of unbelievable high moments, but also tremendous pressure and personal challenges. And in a community that is rapidly changing. Um, as a congregational rabbi, talk to me about that second command about idolatry. And I love your take on it because, and then I want a follow up question that's really bothered me, and I've asked a lot of colleagues this, but you know, how difficult is it to fight this fight against contemporary idolatry in America right now?
You know, I would not describe myself as an idolatry maximalist. I don't see idolatry in, I don't think that your cell phone is an idol, and I don't think that Twitter is an idol or Facebook or whatever. I think for me, the best way of understanding it is, in whose service are you working? In whose service are you acting when you make decisions about how to spend your time and energy? I'll give you an example from the Congregational Rabbinate that's very much at the front of my mind this month, and that is that something that a scholar named Moshe Halbertal wrote about idolatry is that idolatry isn't just worshiping the wrong thing, classically speaking. It's not just bowing down to a statue or a tree or whatever and endowing it with divine characteristics that it doesn't have. Halbertal points out that at least in the thought of Maimonides, idolatry can also refer to the practice of worshiping the right thing in the wrong way. You can be idolatrous in the way that you worship God. So to me, what the relevance is in that teaching to my life today is we're having to make very difficult and painful decisions today about how we worship in our synagogue in the world of the coronavirus. Is recreating and returning to worship in a chapel or sanctuary the highest good, or might there be some higher value in whose service we make the decisions about how we pray? We might be creating a worship service that is less majestic, less dignified, less powerful, and less affective. If we tell people we can't permit you to crowd the sanctuary again and sing at full voice around each other when we're in the midst of a very contagious pandemic. But I would argue that by bringing everybody back and crowding the pews once again, that feels to me like an act of idolatry, because it is worshiping the right thing, worshiping the God of Israel, but doing it in the wrong way, doing it in a way that risks people's health and well-being. And we know that's an improper way to approach God. If you're approaching God in a way that's going to wind up risking other people's health and their lives, you're doing it wrong.
So let me ask you a question, personal. This comes up in the conversations around this commandment and idolatry, and I often reflect back to the old prayer book, if you remember, The Gates of Blue, The Gates of Prayer, page 240, top paragraph, which is my favorite prayer in that prayer book, about be careful what you worship because you become what you worship. But do you sense at all that the Jewish community today has made idols of certain things that we worship? That phrase that you just used, that worshiping the right thing in the wrong way. I'm thinking of the way people react to the kotel, the wall. And it is a sacred space, but it's almost become, at the risk of sounding too crazy, almost idolatrous about, having almost magical powers. So I love your take on that. If you think, based upon this conversation of this commandment and Reuben's really, really wonderful essay.
It's great. Yeah, the kotel is tough because it is true that it's approaching, if not already surpassed, this kind of fetishistic role in some people's spirituality. That you're right, that people may believe that by touching this stone and not that one, your prayers will have a different outcome. By saying the right words with your face pressed against the right part of this stone wall, it's going to have a different outcome than somewhere else. And one of the reasons that I am the kind of Jew that I am is that I don't think that that those stones are any holier than other stones. But the issue of the kotel is also more complicated because, like we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, it's also a political conversation. And I think one reason that those on the religious left are reluctant to cede their grip on access to the kotel is that in Israel today, in the realpolitik of religious life in Israel, you concede territory to others at your own peril and risk. And I think that at least in Israel, the religious left, the reform and progressive movements in Israel, at sometimes have said, you know what, forget it, you can have it, we'll pray over here instead. And the result has not always been a net gain to the movement. The result has been that the reform movement is shunted further aside, further down toward the southern side of the wall, and that the access to the kotel has essentially been surrendered to the state rabbinate and those on the far fringe right. So it's really super complicated and super tangled. Every time I lead congregants or travelers to Israel, I'm always very careful to make sure people know that you're not praying to the wall. Your prayers are not going to those stones, but that we think that something special happens when you're in this place, and that if it's a way that helps you direct your prayers and your intentions toward God and helps you think more clearly about the generations of your family and your people, to whom this part of the world was sacred, great. But yeah, don't make the mistake that the wall is God, that the wall is itself possesses any kind of magic powers, exactly like you said.
Rabbi Oren Hayon, the senior rabbi of Congregation Emanu in Houston, Texas, the editor of Inscribed, subtitled "Encounters with the Ten Commandments," recently published by the CCAR Press, available at all major outlets, I would imagine, including Amazon, etc., and the press itself.
Right.
A great book. And again, for our colleagues or educators who may hear this podcast, it's a great teaching tool, not only for your book clubs, but adult education and also confirmation class, because they need to, some of these essays really speak to everything that these young people are living. So, Oren, thank you very, very much.
It's my pleasure. I'll also put in another plug for the study guide that the folks at the CCR Press have put together. Very helpful if you're running a book club or a class discussion with other lay people. You don't need your rabbi or professor to lead you through this book. The point was to really make it accessible to as wide an audience as possible. And
how do they get the study guide?
So the study guide is available on the CCAR Press website. And Richie, I can share the link with you if you want to share that with your listeners as well.
Yeah, that would be great. If you send it to us, and we'll post it when we post the podcast and everything, so people can just one-stop shopping. Anyway, Oren, stay safe, stay healthy, good luck. I know it's coming up, Shana Tova, and just have a great year and take care of yourself and your family, and everything else will take care of itself. So, Toda Rabah.
Amen. Thank you so much for the time. It was a great opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, believe me. And again, all of you, thank you for listening to this edition of Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. And a reminder, you can follow us on our on the website, jewishsacredaging.com, as well as Jewish Sacred Aging on Facebook. And we appreciate any tax-free donation that you would like to make to help us further our work. You can go to the website, click on the donate icon. If you wish to send me a comment or suggestion for future programs, Rabbi Address at jewishsacredaging.com is the screen. These podcasts are recorded at the studios of Lubetkin Global Media in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and are produced by Steve Lubetkin. Again, thank you for being with us. We look forward to greeting you on the next Seekers of Meaning, the podcast of Jewish Sacred Aging. Toda and Shalom.